Christendom, and I'm starting here in the chapter for this one because it's going to scroll a little bit differently. And so from our reading here is going to open up here, and for this I'm just going to point out because it's not a continuous scroll. We are right here in this second book. Remember, there's a Civ book and a humanities book proper, and so now we're starting to drift a lot more into the humanities book. And so in fact, this whole chapter, several of the whole chapters coming up, the modules coming up will be a little they won't look as bad, but it's about the same amount of material. So I've upped the smart book quizzes in these sections because it's just more stuff all at once. But they don't scroll all the way down. You got to advance them. And so that's what I'm going to do when I go over this screencast. Okay, so here to start out with, we mean roughly 1,000 to 1,300. And we are getting to the point to where this Gothic cathedral is the spiritual heart of the medieval city. And usually, as the mythologist Joseph Campbell pointed out a long time ago, usually the most important buildings in a civilization are the tallest. And so definitely Gothic in this period. This would seem this is a fascinating presentation topic, of course, if you want to do this, the Chartres Cathedral. But it's also, you can even see here, it seems very uniform from far away, but the closer you get and the more you look at it, you can see why does this look different than this spire here? So it all goes back to the construction, different building crews, and we're not going to linger too much on it here because I'm going to pick it up later, and it's hard to see from this angle. But what happened with these Gothic cathedrals, they were finally able to not really perfect, but at least get a lot better at how you can push these buildings higher and get the weight on going through several sort of distinctive layers of getting the weight of the building into the ground without it falling over. So it's a technological achievement as well. In the case of why it looks so differently, because it's such an elaborate project, they actually had different building crews doing this at the time. Okay, but all of this is coming up. Medieval church. So the Roman Catholic Church, remember, it lasted a long time. We are concerned right now, this is not the only function of it, but in part, especially when you go back in history, it's more a political institution, right? For our purposes anyway. It's not that all the other stuff didn't happen, it's that it had some political influence. But I do want to point this out because we know about this sort of stuff, but it's the degree that it's important is not in our society now. So I'm going to say that the church has powers that I guess still technically they have, but people don't take them seriously as like they did back then. So they can send you to your eternal soul to hell. They can. And matter of fact, the local priest can. So the local priest, remember in these communities, if you're in a small town back in the day, you're probably never leaving that small town, maybe once, to go on a pilgrimage or something like that. So what that local priest can do is excommunicate you from the sacrament, which means you're going to hell, right? So that's a lot of power over you. At a larger level, they can interdict the excommunication of an entire city or statehood. They would threaten this sometimes to, like before we even get into the Henry VIII stuff down the road. This is like if towns were a little bit too fond of jousting, for instance, they would send a cardinal around and threaten to interdict the whole. They wouldn't do it, but they would threaten to do it, and then dispatch a cardinal. And jousting is bad. And they don't mean just the actual tournaments. It was basically like a big carnival atmosphere that would come with all that, with all the stuff you would think that would come with it. And then people just loved jousts back in the day, in this time period. And then they would often, but the cardinal would show up sometimes if it was really bad. They would wait the cardinal out and like have riders set up to make sure that he left. And then they would send it, and they would just start up all over again. So it's kind of some of this stuff. So we take the Middle Ages seriously, and we want to say way back when there was all this serious stuff going on. But do realize that there are a lot of, this is a long period, and there are a lot of contradictions in anything I say in this course, but pretty much anything anyone says about the Middle Ages to start out with. All right, so remember, priests can also marry you. You are different. You're a different entity after you get married, just because the priest says so. Right. So this is before we have legal marriages where the state says so. Accuse you of heresy. Make water or make the wine. Turn holy water, I guess is what I'm getting at here. Can baptize. Priests can do this, but other people can't do this. All right. So they have powers that other people do not have. All right, so these are important for cultural unity. So it's not just that one priest in one small town in France has this. It's wherever the Catholic Church has a presence. And remember, they're all getting trained roughly the same way, which is very different than things that are happening in different areas of the world. Okay, so while the church persecuted heretics and all of that, civilizing age are also a norming agent, right? So we tend to think, so I'm going to give you this, it doesn't seem like we should talk about this here, but I made a little note. So we're going to talk about Achilles and Moses. So what do we mean by the civilizing? Well, just look at the word. The civil, or from the Latin, the civis, right? So meaning that the root of the civilization where everyone's gathered together. What we're going to value now, we're going to value people acting the way that we have come to associate people acting in the West. So we're being devout as good. But if I say, well, wait a minute, if I want to throw a monkey wrench in all this, I can say, well, it wasn't always viewed as good. And you say, well, yes, it is back in the day. No. Because if you go back to the Greeks, for example, the Greeks thought like Achilles was how you should. They didn't think that like you should act like Moses. Right? The idea of acting like Moses, they would have considered unmanly. Right? Same thing with the Romans. Right? The Greeks also valued being extremely crafty. So like Odysseus. Right? So while they are not technically Bibles like we think of Bibles, you can think of the Iliad and the Odyssey have the same kind of function. They're supposed to teach you how to act, what you should aspire to do and be. And that is very different than how you should aspire to act and be in the Bible, although it overlaps sometimes. So, for example, Joshua in the Bible, great conqueror, right? But it's all also very humble in front of the Lord. So you don't see that sort of thing with a lot of the Greek heroes. So everybody values strength at times and all that, but obedience. I'm below God. I am below the representative of God. At least, like, this is the public line and so on. So this helps to really organize society. It gets everybody on the same page. It's part of the cultural stuff. Okay, so baptisms, confirmations, when you're going to become really an adult, as it were. Ordinations, not the local priest, but a higher authority. Matrimony, penance, Eucharist. So this is not questioned in the day. Later on, Martin Luther, the Lutherans, and the protesters, the people who are protesting the Catholic Church, and we're going to end up calling Protestants when they break away and do a different denomination. This is going to be one of the things that they challenge, right? The Eucharist. They're going to say it's not literally the blood and body. That's not what the priest is literally making. It's a metaphor, right? And then they end up having it out basically several hundred years from this time period. But right now they don't. Right now everybody is going along with this. Mysticism we're going to bring back up. There are plenty of mystics if you wanted to pick one of these, not just the ones in the books here to do a presentation over. So mystics, intuitive and direct knowledge of God. And so I'm going to point out here, they're going to talk about the good mystics, or the mystics who don't cause problems. So notice that in the nature of the church, which is a hierarchy, right? So you go to priests, and then the bishops are above them, archbishops, and then you step it up all the way to the Pope. Right? So one person on top of that. This is by the Great Chain of Being, by the way. It's also a good presentation topic that I'm not covering here because our book doesn't cover it. But in the Middle Ages, they conceived of the entire universe as very orderly. Everyone had their place in the hierarchy. But mystics now, how are they able to talk to God without going through or getting intermediated with a priest? So this was around, but notice that in and of itself, it's also a threat. Because what if people start saying, well, this person's talking with God, well, let's talk with this person then about God and what God wants, and not necessarily with the priest who the priest reports to, this structure that's been around a long time, and so on. So this is what Joan of Arc is going to get in trouble with back down the time. But they're also just sort of mystics in and of, they're not really concerned with the warrior type stuff. They just want to say, well, I learned this about God, right? Which may or may not conflict with what was going around at the time. But Hildegard is the example that they give. As far as the church goes, she doesn't cause them a lot of problems. And she writes a lot of mystical stuff. And I will, you can explore this on your own. They're going to point out other mystics along the way, and so Muslim mystics, Sufi mystics, Rumi, Saint Francis. Huge tradition. If you see a pope taking the name of Francis, what he's signaling is, now popes change their name when they become the pope, that I'm going to have a special affinity for the poor. All right, renounce the life of wealth, and he actually came from wealth and comfort, but he said, I'm going to go the other way. And this, while he himself is a very important person, his legacy just keeps living on. This is a huge stream in not just Catholicism, but in Christianity in general. But you could research the actual order. So there are followings at the time. People are organizing monasteries around his principles and so on. Go back up. So this is the clunky part about putting it on there. So medieval towns, usually established near highways or rivers. Rivers were especially good back in the day because people navigated around them. So even in our area, Fort Worth, right? The oldest part of Fort Worth was an actual fort around a bend in the Trinity River. And there's I won't have time to get into here, but it's a really funny story about how they tried to blow up the Trinity River and navigate it, and they never could get it right. And even into sections of Dallas, right where Kennedy gets assassinated, that's where the Trinity River used to go. When the motorcade goes down, and the thing, people get it confused and say, well, how could Oswald get that angle of the bullet? Well, that's where the Trinity River ran. They just later on they changed the route of that. But rivers is how people got along, especially even into Texas, when Texas was a young land as far as the U.S. is concerned anyway. Everybody's been here much longer than before we got here. So usually would be a minor fort, much like Fort Worth started out as a minor fort, and then people would build around the fort. This is everywhere. This is Chinese, Great Wall of China sections of it. This is the Acropolis that we did cover back in ancient Athens. The whole city, a new section of the city sprung up or from around that in times of peace, right? People start trading around there. It's the center of town, the burbs, the suburbs, and so on. Keep going. Medieval drama is we're starting to move back into I guess we already are here, into the ideal period, where we don't like realism as much. And these open air theaters are meant to teach you, like this is how you should act to get right with God, to keep right with God, to keep the devil away, that sort of stuff. There are a few of them. So by and large, the people in theater kind of skip over this whole 1,000 years or so, and so they'll especially like talking about the Greeks, right? That's very tough to beat the Greek playwrights until of course, William Shakespeare is going to come along, as we're going to see in the future, who beats everyone. It's in terms of most people's opinion, anyway. Dante, epic. So Dante is so they're talking about the larger work here. Most people don't really care about the larger work. Most people only care about the Inferno, which is the first third of the work, which is where we get a lot of our images from hell. All right, so not all of them. He thinks the very center of it is like ice. Like there's no light. It's very cold and all that. But in a lot of the other things that happen along the way, as Dante descends through hell, or down into hell, I guess I should say, with his tour of Virgil, a lot of the stuff that shows up in modern movies, and it's because Dante wrote so visually. So when you hear people talking about hell, it is worth sometimes checking out. Like if you are into it, or your friend is, you say, okay, well, where do you see this in the Bible? And you're probably going to find out that it's not in the Bible at all. Probably the root of what they're talking about goes back to the Inferno, especially if it's an image. So film picked this up last century for us. Medieval universities. So they started out to train priests, is why we had a medieval university. So think. So not by this time, the guy that I've been bringing up, Augustine of Hippo, is in the background. He's kind of like in the intellectual water, so to speak, for this group of people. Lots of other people have different ideas, but more or less on the same page about theology, how we should train priests, all that sort of stuff. Later on in the Middle Ages, great thinker Thomas Aquinas comes in. So this is high Middle Ages here, and he synthesizes. In their minds, they thought there was people at the time thought that we had a big problem because we didn't fully reconcile Greek philosophy with Christianity, but we kind of did. We just did it mostly with Plato, and nobody really overtly talks about Plato because they knew Plato wasn't a Christian. But so they steal his ideas, and what we really mean by that is it's when Aristotle gets reintroduced and some of the other Greek thinkers, because he was some of the Greek works were lost for a long time, even though it sounds odd. That the Islamic people actually had some of the primary documents, and they reintroduced it later, and it kind of set all this off again. And so what we really mean by getting the other important Greek thinkers in. Benedictine is a whole other vein. That's very much worth studying. Very practical too. So besides just the actual spiritual part of all this, how should you get along with people in fairly contentious times? You wouldn't think about. You would think that, well, I'm going to go live in an abbey, I'm going to be a monk and all that. Everything's just all peaches and roses, I guess. But it's not. They got to work every day. They got to be around each other all the time. And so when you get to the writings of some of these monks, who, you know what they're complaining about most? My God, this guy always, every night he's snoring. I can't get any sleep. It's this, like, yeah. So how do you get through all that and feel the larger purpose? Lots of monasteries and abbeys through Western Europe. So this is very unlike today. So the ruins of a lot of these are around, and the ones that they've kept up are still. But Europe, by and large, we're going to talk about why later, but Europe, by and large, is not a very religious place now. Okay, so when they changed it, originally, before we get to full-on huge Gothic, so limited by the size and availability of roofing timber, wooden superstructure, all these things can burn down. Romanesque versus Gothic. And so this is the convenient comparison contrast. So Romanesque aren't as tall. It's a little more stodgy, and they're like, if this was Gothic, it would be way up here, higher. So these are generally considered sturdier. I mean, I'm saying that, and I'm kind of questioning when I say it, but that's the way the conception sort of is at the time. It's there a lot of support in here because they're not pushing the weight as the Gothic cathedrals are out through the walls. So, but notice here that you don't have, so you've got these windows here, but you got some white here, but it's not as, like, you need artificial light to see what's going on here. So it tends to be more somber, reverent, I guess, if you feel that way. Something else. So what I'm getting at, I guess, here is this creates a very different religious atmosphere than the Gothic. And in both these time periods, unlike today, so this is not that far off in terms of years and sometimes overlapped. The idea here originally, before the priest turns to face the congregation, was that everybody is facing this way, like Moses in front of the children of Israel, and you're worshiping God like that. Like you can kind of picture it from the Old Testament. You go back through the sections of Genesis and Exodus. All right, and we want to get to, I think the next thing is, of course, Gothic. I don't know why people use the term Gothic I think it still references teenage girls with dark hair and funny nails, but I'm not exactly sure, and if that's too negative, I'm sorry. That seems to be the way people talk about it. I'm not sure if that's what it is or not, but that's not at all what we mean in this time period, is what I'm getting at. So later on, after this period, highfalutin people started calling this kind of architecture rude and barbarous. And we don't really think of it as rude and barbarous now, so it sort of calls the question about this era here, who preferred the classical, meaning Greek and Roman forms. All right, but Gothic cathedrals, huge. The interior space was huge because they figured out how to support it differently, so they didn't need as many columns, support columns in the middle of it. And we're going to get to this idea of really pushing the idea of, and this is what I want to talk about here. So these buttresses, so this is a tremendous amount of weight up here and a huge interior. So if you do that without these, it's going to fall apart because the wind loads, the extra pressure on the foundation of it, and so on. So if you were to see the stresses in here, all of this is helping to push the weight out to a larger area. And sort of some weight's going here, some through here, around the edge. And it was very difficult to perfect over time. But now, see, look at this. Lot more lights coming in through stained glass, but a lot more is coming in. By the way, they knew for a lot of these cathedrals where the sun was at different times of year. So what they can do is try to augment the services a little differently. So if you know that the Easter sun's going to come up this way, right, and you say, well, maybe it would help to have some yellow stained glass here, green, something like that. And if the sun's going to come up this, I'm making all this up as I go, but if it's going to come up here around Christmas, maybe we put the red and blue stained glass there, and so it augments the service a little bit differently. And gargoyles are worth mentioning here. These are protection. These are not bad. I'm not sure how it got into society that these are bad, except for that. And I know we're in an age now where probably a lot of you haven't seen this, but there's a classic movie called The Wizard of Oz, and the witch has the flying monkeys. And then I think people confused those two, or conflated those. I guess, I'm not really sure, but gargoyles are protectors, and they need to look kind of horrendous because they are fighting the evil spirits, right? They're telling evil spirits, you better not, right? You better not try to contaminate this house of God. So they got to be rather like a lineman in the NFL, right? You want them to be a little nasty, I guess, at the end of the day, and hopefully your NFL lineman not causing too many penalties. Notice that we are now back to, I'm just going to point out that this is ideal. So not real. This is flat, two-dimensional. Well, you can even remember from that Egyptian section later on. So when we get away from the stick Egyptian stuff, the Egyptians knew how to give the appearance that birds were taken off here. And you can, if you remember in the Greek section, the guy that was kind of coiled up and he was about to throw the disc. Okay, so none of that is suggested here. So because they didn't want it, they didn't like it, right? So we're back to ideal, the world as it should be. And all these halos here, by the way, they probably lifted from the Egyptian. The Egyptians used to do this with suns back in the day, and only for gods in the Egyptian times. But it seemed to translate over time and around the Mediterranean basin to spiritual people who were in right with God, right? So prophets, Mary, people had extra spiritual significance. This is not my area of expertise. So I'll just tell you that it came out of the monasteries. This is the kind of stuff that I think is neat. Instead of relying on memory alone, singers now started making songbooks with words and music. So now we can have a much better idea of what's happening because we can get those books after they're recorded. And this didn't play, hopefully this plays in your book. It did not play in mine. So while we're here, we mean stuff like this. Y'all have heard this before. That's probably enough. I just wanted to give you the idea. You can present over just about anything mentioned here. We're going to move back to, after a long time ideal, we're going to start moving back to realism again. You could see with the actual touch seeming to happen here. But they're not very, sort of getting there, but still not very lifelike faiths. And we're skipping over, of course, large sections of the world. So if you were interested along the way, Shiva, any of the Hindu gods, venerated god of destruction and creation, regenerative force. Bodhisattvas, so not just Buddha, but they're beings who have postponed their enlightenment to help us, essentially. Big thing in Buddhism. All right, and I think that will do it for this little bit longer chapter.